What follows is free. But if you want to see the full extent of what we do and get involved, go to patreon.com/word in your ear. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Now, Peter Jackson's Get Back series poured petrol on the worldwide obsession with the Beatles. And I'm talking now to someone who's been stoking that particular fire for years, because he's written about, I think, another 11 or 12 books about the Beatles. And we've talked on previous pods about two of them, The Last Days of John Lennon and his fantastic biographies of George Martin. But he's just revised and updated one of these books, Long and Winding Roads, principally because the beleaguered world needs as much about the Beatles as it can get at the moment. It's very good to see him again. Ken, how are you? Ken Womack.
I'm doing very well, and it's so great to see you again, even virtually. And I think I agree with you. The world needs more Beatles now than ever.
Don't you think it does? Because there's something very comforting about the Beatles story. It's so colourful, and it's so optimistic, and it's so eternally young, isn't it? It ended when none of them were out of their 20s, and it just seems so positive. Am I right?
It does, and the world is frankly cruel and mean too often, and the Beatles remind us that there is another way.
There is another way, precisely. Now, you were born, I think, around the middle of the Beatles period. I think you were about 3 or 4 when they split up. So how did you discover them? Can you remember how you discovered them and how you pieced together their story?
Well, I wish I could say it was early language acquisition, but it was nothing of the sort. It was in the 1970s, and my breakfast watching television before going off to school, and my favorite show was canceled. It was gone. And they had those, pretty lame Beatles cartoons on. Yeah, I'd never seen them before, and they showed whatever the first episode was in the series, and there they were. And I wasn't impressed by the cartoons because, of course, the animation really looked old by the 1970s.
Yeah.
But the music, of course, is the music, and I immediately had the same reaction I think that our students have right now, which is, where has this music been all my life?
Can you remember what order you discovered things? Can you remember which songs because I'm old enough to have been, alive and listening to them when the Beatles story was still developing. So I saw it all in chronological order. But for you, can you remember what sort of things you got hold of first?
I think I basically can. Of course, they were always there. I lived in the world. So, there was a familiarity once I began to delve into the Beatles music with everything, because it had always been in the ether as it was then and it is now. So there was an instant familiarity. But the first couple of songs I heard via the cartoons, I believe, were "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "Help." And my father, being fantastic and sitting right over here in his wonderful home, went to the Houston Public Library and got all of the Beatles books for me. There weren't very many then. I think there were like
what would there have been? They
would have been remember Walter Brosnick, Walter, his books, and The Twilight of the Gods.
Oh, okay.
You remember that one? And I suppose the Hunter Davis biography.
Hunter Davis, certainly, which came out, I think, while they were still going with it. That's right, yeah.
That's right, 68. And anyway, so he picked up the books, because if you're going to get into something, you need to study it, right?
Yeah.
He said right. And then secondly, he went and bought a Beatles album for me, and it was the Beatles' Greatest. And this is it was Odeon, the German title. Or I guess
I'd say we didn't have that over here.
It would have been the West German title.
Yeah.
At that time, and it was just an international compilation. That was certainly not part of the official canon.
So why did they strike you at that early age as being so special? Because you then embarked on a vast amount of your life, in fact, devoted to writing about them. What was it that made you think they were so exceptional?
Wonder. I think about that. Well, first of all, I think I have the experience that the students I have right now in my Beatles class have, and that is, when you make that discovery, you're going through the looking glass, right?
Yeah.
Life is different. It will never be the same again, at a certain level. And I've seen kids do it as young as 5. I've seen folks as old as 70, make these discoveries, and it's uncannily similar and familiar every time it happens. But I think in my case, we're getting on, it's 1977 or so. I love the music of the 1970s. In fact, on some, I probably like the 70s better than the 60s.
Yeah.
But, that's a particularly plasticine period. You've got Disco Duck and all these things. You've got the Bee Gees, of course, and other bands. There's a lot of sort of fluff in the air.
Yeah.
There's kind of those groovy late 70s love songs. And the Beatles very instantly seemed more substantial. Now my 11-year-old ears did not think in these ways, but I imagine it was something like that, because I just discovered top 40 radio. And so I was listening to a lot of the current music. And, once you listen to I Am The Walrus, there's not much else being produced in 1977 that compares.
No, absolutely. So when you started writing, obviously in 2007, when you wrote this particular book, there were a lot of books already about the Beatles. What was it you were trying to do that was different? A lot of them tend to be either the story or the music, and there's clearly an element that both the story and the music are equally represented in yours. But what was it? What was the kind of point of difference that you were aiming for?
I was aiming for the story and the music. So, as you know, I'm both an English professor and a professor of popular music.
Yeah.
As far as my tenured position goes, and so I bring both of those elements to the story, and I believe they're important. And when I wrote the book you're holding there, I was thinking of those great old literary biographies of Joyce and Woolf and Dickens, those huge tomes where they'll tell you the story of the life, but when they get to the old curiosity shop, they stop and provide you with a contextual interpretation.
Yes, a summary of the plot and the characters. That's right.
Sure, and they demonstrate the artistic growth. And I do believe the Beatles' great future centuries from now will purely be about the art, and less all of the time about anything that may seem remotely scandalous or sensational. It will really just really be about the art, because that is what stands the test of time. So I wanted to write a book that explored that evolving artistry. And as you know, there is nothing else like the Beatles in painting, in music, certainly besides themselves. They're unparalleled in literature. Nobody else starts at Love Me Do fairly primitively and ends with, Abbey Road. That is, and does it in just 7 years and change. That's remarkable. And it's that trajectory that I'm endlessly interested in, trying to understand it. I had a student, we just did Magical Mystery Tour last 2 nights ago in my Beatles class in New Jersey. And this kid just really wonderfully summed it up as we finished Magical Mystery Tour, and we talked about the very poor showing, right, on Boxing Day, etc. And he said, you know what? The Beatles are different in so many ways, but one of them is how they come out on the other side of psychedelia. He said they come out as better musicians, where he said so many other acts, and he began to reel off several other artists from that period, tend to become mired in the form. And he's right? They come out and it's Lady Madonna and Across the Universe and Hey Bulldog. And
that's a good point.
Yeah, it was just really wonderful. And of course, this guy's 18.
That's really good. God, Magical Mystery Tour, I can remember watching on Boxing Day on the telly. And part of the disappointment was because we had black and white television. A lot of people had black and white television. So you kind of missed out on the magic of it. But I was going to ask just about, apart from really obvious pivotal moments when they met Brian Epstein and when they met George Martin or whatever, the big hits, were there any major pivotal moments, do you think, in the Beatles story? There were many, but are there any particular ones that struck you as being absolutely crucial?
Our friend Mark Lewison's been celebrating one all week on Twitter, which I think is really fantastic. And I remember discussing this with him years ago when he was making these discoveries. And that is when they decide to make an album. That was a brash move to make a record, to make a long playing record. And simply on the strength of Love Me Do. And of course, by this point, he'd heard Please Please Me. But Just that decision to embark on this very self-conscious phase with him and with Brian, and meeting without instruments to discuss and plot the trajectory of the band.
That's right. We're talking about that one particular day when George Martin saw the potential of the group, didn't he?
Yeah, and it's just fantastic because it's moments of recognition like that need to happen for great art to ensue. And I celebrate Mark for thinking of that and pushing that so diligently just this last week, because it's true, right? I mean, that it began a new phase, very important early on. But we could go on about all the important moments. My gosh, 2 months later from that, right, with Big Mal getting in the van.
Absolutely.
In the middle of the big freeze, the worst snowstorm and blizzard in history, where the channel's frozen over and they go down to London because they have to consolidate the success of Please Please Me. And they were willing to do anything. They're lucky they didn't die in some terrible ditch in the north that weekend.
Well, it was your book that where I first learned of one of the extraordinary facts, I think, about the Beatles. Again, one of those extraordinary coincidences that George Martin had turned down the Beatles, and the managing director, L.G. Wood of EMI, had kind of fallen out and had a disagreement, hadn't he, with George Martin, because George Martin was having an affair with his secretary, of which the chairman disapproved enormously, managing director. And he therefore ordered him, pretty much, didn't he, to sign the Beatles. Am I right?
He did, and
which is an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Because if that hadn't happened, then maybe it would have been completely different, as it would have been so many examples of that.
Absolutely, and it's a transformative moment, because George was kind of at loggerheads anyway with EMI. He wanted more money. He wanted to be credited and to earn dollars, pounds for royalties and residuals and those sorts of things, and Wood wasn't having it. When you look at that, there's also a sense that they all knew that Brian was the biggest record retailer in the North, that they needed to keep him happy. And, it was almost a company-wide recognition that, why didn't we sign this? This costs us nothing, as Mr. Lewison discovered. Those penny per record contracts were that bad. There was no value to them, to the artist, unless you became, the Beatles, because otherwise it was so slanted in the EMI group's favor that, you would never really see any money out of it. So the risk was so low that, it was kind of a sad moment that they didn't just hand out that contract like candy the first time Brian came around, because he's the biggest record retailer. You got to keep him happy. Look at what they've done over the years, right?
Exactly.
To keep record retailers happy, sending them off on cruises and great vacations and these. What's the difference between handing out a
record
contract?
Absolutely.
So when you look at it in that way, it was such a it was a no-brainer, right, as folks would say. And George, of course, could just shrug and say, well, it's your money. The studio, as your colleague just wrote about, was paid for. So, the sunk costs were already there. There was no reason not to. It took that kind of silly turn of events. But
I can never get over how many.
In retrospect, it's just kind of it's kind of dense that they didn't just do it.
I can never get over just how many things needed to happen in the audience, in the sequence in which they happened, for the whole story to have evolved the way it did. But anyway, getting back to the revised, so you've revised and updated Long and Winding Roads. That was 15 years ago. So you've added presumably perspectives and information that you've learned since. So give me some examples of the sort of things that you've come across that have maybe you've added to the book or have changed your view of the story.
Well, frankly, one of the things I did was streamline it in a certain sense. I removed a lot of the literary theory. I apologize to English professors everywhere, but I gutted it. It's
right.
I really felt that it wasn't contributing to the story in the same way that I felt like it was, a couple decades ago. So now it just feels stronger to lean even more so into the, as I talked about a moment ago, that literary biography approach. So I really doubled down on that in a lot of ways, but certainly spoke a lot more about the debt that we know the Beatles owed to African-American rhythm and blues, certainly to understanding as you just identified, the George Martin's role in becoming part of their team. And, one of the things I love talking to the students about is the way in which, with Brian and the Beatles and George, they really went sideways and pushed over an entire industry. It's really quite remarkable. So much training in the world of business is about working and, making sure that you're working inside of policy and protocol and paying your dues. They came in and had to, as you know, shove it over because it wasn't going to listen to them otherwise.
Do you feel, as Martin Lewis obviously does, that you're constantly worried about, having published a book about the Beatles, that new information will come along which you wish you'd excluded? He's obviously haunted by this. Does that bother you as much? That there's going to be whole revelations that you couldn't acknowledge?
Right. So not long after that book came out, well, it was a little bit after that, but he said to me, Mark did, that, he said, you're going to immediately notice a percentage of this is not correct and you can't do anything about it. Yeah. Because, you continue to glean more and more information. So one benefit that this book has is I just carried out an enormous amount of research on Mal Evans. So, I probably carried out about 200 or 300 hours worth of interviews. And
in fact, you're writing a book about Mal now, aren't you, I think?
Yes.
That's right. Now, tell us about that. He's such an interesting character. My goodness. The complications of the life in Liverpool when he has the affair with Pete Best's mum at the time that,
Well,
Pete
that's
Best
Neil. You're thinking
that was Neil. What am I talking about? That was Neil.
Yeah. No. But weirdly, Mal is more complicated than Neil.
Yeah.
Mal is Mal's, he was the odd man out. He was 35. Yeah. He had a job. No, he's not 35 at that point, but he was born in 1935, so he's five plus years older than they are. He had a real job. He had that rare thing in Liverpool. He owned a house. He had a car. Yeah. He had a pension. And it's a triple threat, right? He's been meeting these guys for a year or so in the cavern, and he decides to throw in his lot with them. And he's not the only one, right, who takes this incredible risk. His is just riskier. Yeah. Neil did the same thing when he ran into him. Stu Sutcliffe, from what he told his sister, gosh, I don't know where these guys are going to go, but I want to be with them for a while and see what's going to happen. Yeah. I was talking to Klaus Vormann recently, and he said the same thing. He just wanted to find out what was going to happen. It felt different, but they all realized that it could go for naught. But in any event, Mal throws over his whole life and becomes their most intimate companion. He's with them for everything. And after the disbandment, he's still working extremely closely with George, John, and Ringo and Paul.
Well, it's so touching that, and we should talk about it in some detail in a minute, actually, about Get Back. But it's so touching in that just how devoted he is to them and how he's just, in every respect with the lyrics and getting the anvil for Maxwell Silverhammer, and just he's constantly there just providing. And I remember McCartney talking once about how occasionally he'd have time off, and he once went on a bus trip around London, I think, with Mal, just the two of them going around the top of a double-decker bus, amazing. And then he had that very sad end to his life, didn't he? I think it was something to do with him possession of firearms, or the police thought he had a gun or something. I don't know.
But and he did have a gun. And so I for my work, I interviewed folks who were on the scene. I've got police reports and everything. So very shortly, maybe even exclusive on Word on Your Ear, we'll blow the lid off of everything, because when you go to something like Mal's Wikipedia page, you discover that almost everything is wrong, except his birth date is correct.
Right. What kind of thing? What major things have they got wrong?
The circumstances of his life, of his death. It's just remarkable. It's, we have this kind of, and I think it's supported by experiences like the Get Back docuseries. We have this belief that Mal is this, kind of overgrown teddy bear, right?
Yeah.
He's lovable, he'll do anything, and he does, but he, as you alluded to before, he had this extensive network. He knew every police chief. I was recently told by John's assistant, David Richter, he knew every police chief in every town in the world. And that's a valuable Rolodex then and now.
Absolutely.
Imagine, so Mal was very canny about building relationships, and there were many times he would have given his life for them. Certainly the Philippines, he was prepared to.
That's right. No, it's astonishing. I was going to ask a bit about the McCartney lyrics book, because that came out quite recently. And do you think that's changed people's view of McCartney's lyricist? Do you think that's that there's a lot more understanding of just how extraordinary he was? I mean,
that's a tough call. So I reviewed it very positively in my Salon column. The photographs and the imagery and the illustrations alone are just dynamite. And
they're wonderful, aren't they? Yeah.
There's a danger, though, right? As he continues to delve into this story, as ideas and events run together. I would have for nothing helped correct some of the timeline in there.
Yes,
I hope they do that at some point, because actually
that's frustrating that it's full of those factual errors.
It is, and because he deserves more. And whoever was working on the project with him, I really wish they'd approached it like that, because this does have scholarly value. People are going to make distinctions based upon some of this information. But the one takeaway I have that I do I feel very positively about is the understanding that, Paul was always a thinker about literature. In another world, he would have been an English major like me.
Yeah.
He clearly, he loved story. He loved writing. He wrote essays as a kid. We all famously know about his Queen Elizabeth II essay, right? He just had an extraordinary connection with narrative, and the book really underscores that. There are other moments where you can tell he's searching his memory banks and trying to remember things. And like I said, I would have gladly been there and said, Paul, I think you meant this. This was 1966, not 67, pal, chum. Yeah,
you're wondering if some of those revelations are so extraordinary. You think, why hadn't he come up with them before? In
the last months of his life, and another very important figure, I'd come to know him anyway, but we'd started to speak about doing a kind of lecture tour, and that was Jeff Emmerich. And and I was working with him and his team to maybe take his book and go through and really cleanse it, because it has all sorts of factual inaccuracies, and it really needs that. If you're listening, Jeff Emmerich's heirs, it still needs that kind of work.
Still needs you.
It needs to be cleansed, because now that I have Mal's diaries and all of Mal's manuscripts and his memorabilia, you can really pinpoint that a lot of those dates when he has Mal in the studio, Mal was, he was working for the GPO.
There's a lovely bit in your book when you said, in the provocative master text of Eleanor Rigby, A Day in the Life, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Revolution, various others, you say the Beatles mine the inherent truth of Socrates' famous dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that was great. So is it particularly with songs like that, you're talking about the detail that brings them? Is it the level of observation in the lyrics that you find so appealing?
Sure. So, I bet you've had this commentary at times where folks question, well, why do you take these artifacts of popular culture and analyze them so much? And that's inherent in Socrates' words too. And if you're going to become involved in anything that's worthy of pursuit, I go back to my father, my gosh, 40 something years ago, and saying, if you're going to study this, let's get some real books from the library. And that's what we did. And it took me a long time to understand the power of that kind of analysis. But, if you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time with anything, whether it's the latest episodic television show on HBO or Star Wars or, or my gosh, or the novels of Charles Dickens, to do so in a learned fashion only makes it a richer experience. And the Beatles reward us for that,
Yeah.
Or you learn about all of those elements, and there are hundreds of them that go into a song like I Am the Walrus, which is fresh on my mind from class. It's extraordinary, all of these pieces coming together, and now we have such wonderful technology to be able to demonstrate.
That's so true. If you can see
right
all
down to Shakespeare at the end, right?
Yeah. No, I'm the Walrus is a really good example. You can see all that kind of Lewis Carroll kind of, that kind of pastoral poetry of England. There's so much art, and there's so many things, and the more you know about it, the more you appreciate it. It's fantastic. No, I was going to ask about whether there was any aspect of each of the four of them that you felt is underappreciated. Is there anything about I always look at George Harrison's guitar playing. He was 18 when he wrote the guitar part to Till There Was You. And you think how beautiful those embroideries are that on those Beatles songs. They're never really taken for granted. I think. Is there anything about it you think?
I don't mean to steal your thunder, but I think that's exactly the most important one.
Yeah.
The embroidery that George provides for all of those early songs, for which he's not given credit, right, as a songwriter, and that's another subject. But those beautiful lines on "Please Please Me," right? Those in the margins of the song, they make the song.
Yeah.
Or I was talking to Colin Hay, our good friend, the old Men at Work fellow, recently, and we were talking about what makes She Loves You work, and he said, "Oh, I know where you're going," and he sang the guitar phrase, that little phrase that George would play between the verses.
That's right.
It just,
that little sting. It's fantastic.
It makes the song, and then of course the chiming,
and opening with the chorus,
right? But I mean, it makes the song. And one of the beautiful aspects, certainly, of the Get Back docuseries is we get to watch George do some of that in real time.
Yes, I know, yeah.
As they craft I've Got a Feeling. And then, of course, our good friend Billy Preston shows up. And now George is showing Billy how to find his way into the song and provide those kind of embellishments that make all the difference. So if there's anything that we don't talk enough about, it's their musicianship. They made things difficult seem extraordinarily easy.
It's very moving when Billy Preston arrives and they dances as he comes across the studio floor, and it immediately unites them. And they just remember that he was out there in Hamburg with them, and he wants to hear them play A Taste of Honey, because that's what they used to play at sound checks in Hamburg. And it's a great moment for them, just seeing them kind of reunited, But what did you think generally about the film in terms of the reevaluation of McCartney? Because I mean, it's done his reputation. I think it's repositioned him, actually. I mean, quite rightly. Did you agree with that?
Certainly there's enormous value in those longish sections that we weren't entirely aware of, other than looking to those NAGRA reels all these years. But Paul, creating Get Back out of thin air, on the heels of playing the song that's known as Commonwealth, right? And watching the organic nature of that develop. There was George Martin had a way that he referred to Paul in his later years. He called him the convenor.
Yeah.
And he was, I got this secondhand from a friend of his in his little village in Colesville. And he was trying to explain to a young boy, how the Beatles worked. He said, well, everybody has to have a Paul. You've got to have the convenor, the guy who gets you together, because otherwise it could have been a year before they all got back together. And he actually compared it when he was talking to this young boy. George is in his 80s at this point. And he said, it's like, Mr. Whatever down at the chemist. If he didn't get everybody together, we wouldn't do community events.
Yes.
Paul's the convener. And, but what we do, we pick up so much from Get Back. And we already knew this, but it was wonderful to have such great, vivid testimony, is that he's a virtuoso,
Yes.
He can play anything. You need a guitar solo on Good Morning. He's your guy.
Yeah.
Right. And he'll do it very quickly in an economy of time.
Yeah.
Bass work.
And also that he doesn't just write songs like John Lennon does. He writes records. He can hear precisely how that record's how the song should be arranged. He can hear all the instrumentation. He can hear the tones. there's a bit where he's teaching them Maxwell's silver hammer, and he just goes through, you do this and you do that and you do this, and there pretty much is the basis of the song done. He's got it.
And then there's that wonderful scene where they're whistling it, right? They're all they're in tune, and yeah, that's very different from Lennon, who was more of a grafter, right? He would have this piece that what just like Starting Over was 4 different songs grafted together like Frankensteinian plant or something.
That's right. I think also, I think the other 3 Beatles, particularly Lennon, were quite distracted at the time. McCartney could concentrate totally on the project. And John Lennon had there was a sort of heroin addiction and the new relationship and the divorce and all sorts of things going on. George Harrison, I think, was having an affair, wasn't he, with Charlotte Martin? Was it? I think that's right. And so Pattie Boyd just kicked him out on day. I think it's the 6th of January. You see him walking into the film, and if you research this, you know that the night before Pattie Boyd has kicked him out of the house. So it's quite complicated. And also Ringo, kind of, I don't know, the film career, and it's just drinking quite a lot. And they're all quite distracted, whereas McCartney's is totally concentrating on the project, which does
right. And he's able then to draw them, who are extraordinary talents in their own way, into that story, as you said.
The
record. And it's that kind of vision that makes all the difference. That great read of the way those scenes work together so well.
Yes, I thought, there were just so many moments that were just absolutely knocked me out. Was there anything particular stand out for you? Anything you thought made you think about the Beatles differently? There was a revelation.
Well, the scene, again, for most of my life, I've known about the component parts of this. But seeing them come together in real time and understanding their proximity to each other is important. Dick James showing up on the day that George quit, right? And there he is singing the praises of the extraordinary partnership of Lennon and McCartney. And there's George and Ringo's like, wow, I'd like to be involved in that.
Yes.
And George, you can tell that's just one more item on his docket of pain that he's dealing with in that moment. And not too long afterwards, it puts him over the edge. Not necessarily that element, but all of these things coming together. So that proximity was very, very valuable in that scene to help me really see it in real time. The other thing, as you know, there was a lot of talk in advance of the docuseries about how we'll reconsider the whole experience. It didn't change a thing for me. Because I understood the tenor and the of the traumas of that month. What it did was just cement for me what I believe we've always known, and that is the Let It Be or Get Back / Let It Be saga is the greatest comeback story. It's like a great football team, right? The great ones come back and win.
Yes.
And do it in the last moments before time runs out. And that's what happens. The Beatles are on a clock and it's going terribly, right? You can tell that the old rock and roll songs that they're playing, that 3 months earlier when they were doing the White Album sounded crisp and amazing. Now are weak and lackluster. They're in the doldrums, but they break through all these barriers. A guy quits the group, right?
I know.
John is, as you said, in a kind of stupor. They bring all of those elements back together. They play the rooftop, and then the most extraordinary day, and I understand Peter Jackson's reasoning, but is January 31st when they get in the studio and they make studio versions of all of these songs. What are they working on that day? Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road.
Yes, astonishing.
Don't Let Me Down. That's a career for most groups, and they are creating this. They're cementing the versions of those songs that we've known and loved for 50 plus years. That's magic. It's the greatest comeback story. And after that, they rightly look and feel like they could do anything.
No, that's so right. What did you think about, maybe understand the Yoko Ono position much more, actually? Yoko Ono once said, and I wonder if you had any thoughts about whether or not you agreed with this theory. She said that rather than split the Beatles up I kept them together for longer than they would have stayed together, because John wouldn't go to the studio unless I came with him. And her whole thing was, this may be fanciful on her part, that she, convinced him that he ought to attend the End of the White album sessions, and then the Abbey Road sessions, and obviously the ones in Twickenham. Do you think there's any truth in that or not?
Well, I mean, she has first person testimony, and I think we have to give that a lot of weight. So I do think there's some value to that. I don't think she broke them up. Certainly, I've never believed that. They broke up under the weight,
they broke up, exactly. Yeah,
under so many other issues. I mean, purely generative, right? We're getting older. Paul and John said virtually the same thing. Those old army buddies, right? They both sang the the same tune, explaining why at a certain point a rock band was not supposed to last that long. But frankly. And I'm sure Apple understands this intuitively as well as anybody. It was the best career move any band's ever made, because they left at the height of their powers. They never sullied their image with some crass reunion.
No, they never let you down. They never looked older. They've never produced substandard material.
Their last song's The End, and they leave with this mystique. They cross that street, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's magic, so it's. And I'm not saying that they couldn't have come back together and made a better album than Abbey Road. They certainly had the musical skills at that point. George Harrison is firing on all cylinders. We're about to learn all of the music he's been hiding away all those years with All Things.
Exactly. And there's that great cassette of the conversation that Mark Lewison actually was playing on his tour. Of the conversation they have about the next album after Abbey Road, and it's going to be 4 songs from each of the 3 of them and 2 from Ringo, whatever it is, and they've got it all mapped out. You can imagine it would have been sensational, because you knew some of the songs that they'd written that turned up on their solo albums. So but the point is, it ended when it ended, and that was fundamentally a good thing, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I have no tears for that breakup.
None.
I understand the feeling in the moment, and Mal Evans writes movingly about crying in Paul's garden in his diary. It's just this here for the first time ever on Word on Your Ear. I mean, Mal is broken up. It's his world.
Yes.
Now it rebuilds itself, and he continues on inside of it for several more years. But I understand the moment and the power of the loss in that instant, but in terms of what they've given to music, the framing of their career, there is nothing better than that.
Yes.
I suppose the only counterpart is Mozart, in those last days, composing the Requiem, right, and capping off his own experience. I don't think there's anything close other than that.
That's very well put. There's another lovely quote in your book. It's from Kurt Vonnegut. But Kurt Vonnegut says, the function of the artist is to make people like life better than they have before. Do you think that was one of the things that the Beatles achieved? I mean, was that one of the main?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much you can glean out of their music. It's there for you. And in some of my lowest moments, I remember driving to bad meetings at work that are just like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And I might have a Beatles song. I'll think, you know what? I don't care why we're doing it. As long as that's in my life, it's all okay. Right. That just a very important thought. As long as that exists here, and I can return to that font, at different moments, at different times, it's going to be okay. And Vonnegut really nailed it, which is why I saved it to the end, right? Because it's so true, and of course he wrote it with a little jealousy, right? As great as Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions are, no one ever is.
It's not as good as A Hard Day's Night. No. Oh, look, Ken, it's been lovely talking to you. So you've got the Mal Evans book you're working on at the moment, and that's coming out. When do you think you'll finish that? When will that be out?
Well, it is written, and we'll be unveiling a cover soon. HarperCollins, both in the UK and the US, are handling it, and we should see it around Father's Day here in the US, so mid-June.
Fantastic. Well, as I said before, and I will say again, Long and Winding Roads, the evolving artistry of the Beatles is now revised and updated and fully available for purchase. Is it out now? It is, isn't it? So get in there quick.
It is. It will be shortly. You're ahead of the curve, but that's the way it is with Word in Your Ear. You're always,
Get your orders in. Very nice to talk to you. Thanks so much, Ken. Fantastic.
Oh, thank you.